Call the Subcommittee on Immigration Policy and Enforcement to order. Before we do our opening statements, I just want to let everyone know we're probably going to have the bells going off around 1:35 for a series of votes. We're going to try to get the opening statements and as much of the testimony taken as possible. So maybe we can make it before the votes start. Today, the hearing is focusing on the Chinese Media Reciprocity Act of 2011, introduced by our colleague, U.S. Representative Dana Rohrabacher. It amends the Immigration Nationality Act to ensure open and free access by American journalists in the People's Republic of China. The bill establishes a reciprocal relationship between the number of visas issued to state-controlled media workers in China and in the United States. The bill builds upon already existing law contained within the Immigration and Nationality Act. Visas granted to officials and employees who have been accredited by the foreign government are issued upon a basis of reciprocity. However, the system has been anything but reciprocal. In the fiscal year of 2010, 650 Chinese citizens entered the U.S. with foreign media visas, and so far in fiscal year 2011, 811 Chinese nationals entered the U.S. These reporters are agents of the Chinese government and work for a news organization under the control of the Chinese government, the Chinese government Communist Party, in fact. In contrast, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, the United States government International Broadcasting Agency, is allowed only 2 reporters to be stationed in Beijing. Let us not forget that while the Chinese press has grown, it has also remained a tool of the Communist Party. According to the State Department reports, the United States has let the Chinese Communist Party establish a wide network and diverse media platform to disseminate their message directly in the U.S. At least 14 Chinese state-owned media organizations have a presence in the United States, and their operations in the United States are subject to many fewer restrictions than the operations of American media organizations in China. The state-controlled Chinese news agencies are not subject to censorship or blockage in America. They can cover any news story or express their opinion, any opinion they desire. In contrast, Representative Rohrabacher has reports that the BBG's 2 correspondents in China, one from Radio Free Asia and the other from Voice of America, are harassed by the Chinese police. They have been assaulted, detained by the Chinese officials seeking to block their work. Further, the BBG has its transmissions in China blocked and censored. Their website cannot be accessed by China. In contrast, every edition of China Daily is available anywhere in the United States. H.R. 2899 will assist in rectifying the disparity in treatment of state-controlled journalists in both China and the United States by amending the Immigration and Nationality Act to the state I-visas so that the state I-visas may only be issued to state-controlled media workers from Communist China on the basis of reciprocity, with visas issued to U.S. citizens who are employed by the Broadcasting Board of Governors and who seek to enter China. At this point, I will yield to my colleague from California, the ranking member, Ms. Lofgren.
In the interest of time, I'd ask unanimous consent to put my full statement in the record, and we'll just make a few comments. Clearly, there's no doubt that the Chinese government regularly imposes severe restrictions on freedom of the press. That communist government oppresses its own citizens in many, many ways that we find highly objectionable and wrong. I understand Mr. Rohrabacher's concern about the disparity, and I certainly do not question his motives in proposing this measure. I think I disagree, however, with the approach. I think if we kick out 99% of China's journalists out of this country, I don't think that's going to make the situation better, honestly. I think, to respond to their oppression of the free press with a curtailment of the press strikes me as probably the wrong approach. And I think that will not make China better. It might make us a little worse. And with that, Mr. Chairman, because of the impending votes, I will, again, put the rest of my statement in the record and look forward to hearing this distinguished panel, including our friend and colleague, Mr. Rohrabacher.
And without objection, the gentlelady's comments and entire testimony will be made a part of the record of the hearing. We have 4 distinguished panel witnesses today. Each of the witnesses have written statements will be entered into the record in their entirety. I ask that each of you summarize within 5 minutes. As you know, we are on a tight schedule today, but your entire testimony will be paid a part of the record of the hearing, and we've provided you lights down there that will help facilitate accomplishing that 5-minute rule. Our first witness is our colleague from California, U.S. Representative Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. He represents California's 46th district and is currently serving his 12th term in the U.S. House of Representatives. He serves as chairman and oversight and investigation subcommittee of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and serves on the House Committee on Science and Technology. Prior to serving in Congress, the congressman served as special assistant to President Ronald Reagan. He received his master's degree from USC. And with that, welcome, Dana.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Gallegly and Ranking Member Lofgren. I appreciate you calling this hearing on the aggressive nature of the perception management campaign by the Chinese Communist Party as we see it here in the United States of America. The Chinese Communist Party is attempting to diminish the United States as the world's leader. The military arm of the CCP, the People's Liberation Army, has been undergoing a rapid and alarming buildup and modernization, thanks in large part to an unparalleled level of economic espionage, enormous investment by U.S. corporations, and having been granted most favored nations trading status, the Chinese economy has grown at an expansive rate year after year. This transfer of wealth and power has been due to the Chinese Communist Party's successful use of perception management, especially here in the United States. This is how they continue to get away with stealing our trade secrets, manipulating the currency, receiving millions of dollars in foreign aid from the United States. Millions of American jobs have been lost due to their successful efforts. On the other hand, our government has had little influence within China. While we embrace the free exchange of information, in China, the Chinese Communist Party lacks legitimacy and maintains its grip on power by organized violence and through intimidation. The CCP must control information to stay in power, which means their power both inside China and their power outside China. The Communist Party of China is also afraid of the Chinese people learning the truth, that it goes to great, and they're so afraid of the truth that they go to great ends to jam radio broadcasts, censor the internet, deny visas to Voice of America reporters, and interfere with the work of the two Voice of America reporters that they do allow to operate in Beijing. In contrast, the United States has issued hundreds of visas to Chinese journalists. 811 Chinese entered the United States with visas in fiscal year 2011 alone. We allow the CCP to freely distribute their insidious propaganda without interference, including delivering the China Daily right to our doors of this building. The CCP would never permit Voice of America material to be distributed to the offices of their rubber-stamped parliament in Beijing. A year ago, the largest Chinese Communist Party-controlled news organization moved their North American headquarters to Times Square in New York and introduced an English television broadcast service that runs 24 hours a day. Additionally, they placed a 60-foot-tall advertisement at the north end of Times Square, which is estimated to rent at, just for that sign alone, $300,000 to $400,000 a month. That means in 1 year, the CCP spends the equivalent of a quarter of the VOA's China budget, but just on one sign. I am also greatly concerned the CCP has over 70 Confucius Institute and Confucius classrooms here in the United States. They put teachers and party-approved content masquerading as innocent cultural material on U.S. campuses. And just, of course, a few weeks ago, a Chinese investor, using an undisclosed sum of Chinese state funds, bought the AMC Entertainment movie theater chain. Due to this, the CCP will now influence the content of U.S. movies as well. So finally, let me just state that the CCP is clearly using disinformation to advance nationalistic and homogenistic ends. America should not concede this valuable ground to the Communist Party, and it is not us trying to accept the idea that we're limiting. Let them, if there's going to be reciprocity, let them increase the number of people on our side that are permitted to come in. So the central argument against this, by saying it would lead to a suppression of information here, actually they would then be making that determination. So we are just simply saying reciprocity, and just as soon have it go up rather than down. So I thank you for calling this hearing, and I hope for a markup as well of H.R. 2899 so that we can have this vote come to the floor and we can alert the American people to how we're getting schnookered by the communist Chinese. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman's expired. I thank you for joining us today, Mr. Arbacher. And now we'll move to the second witness, Dr. John Lingzowski. He serves as the founder and president of the Institute of World Politics, an independent graduate school of national security and international affairs here in Washington, D.C. Prior to this, he served in the State Department and the Bureau of European Affairs and as a special advisor to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. Dr. Lingzowski received his master's degree and PhD from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Welcome, Doctor. Could you make sure your mic's on and pull it up? There we go. That's fine.
Congresswoman Lofgren. I'm honored to share some thoughts about the legislation at hand. My concern with the principles on this, underlying this issue, dates back to the Cold War, and it's a very similar situation. Today, we are concerned that China has severely restricted visas for our official broadcasters, as we have discussed. This last year, in contrast to the only two official correspondents we have in Beijing, the State Department granted 868 visas to Chinese media representatives. The diplomatic principle here, reciprocity, is playing out today just as it did in the Cold War. For example, during the Cold War, the State Department had more KGB personnel working in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow than it had Americans. The Soviets had the run of our embassy and could easily identify our intelligence officers and our vulnerabilities. In contrast, we had exactly 0 Americans working in the Soviet embassy here. The State Department's rationale for hiring all these KGB operatives: it was hard to find housing in Moscow for any more Americans. In response to this, we created the Office of Foreign Missions to enforce reciprocity. If the Soviets had trouble securing housing, if the Soviets gave us trouble in securing housing in Moscow, then they would encounter similar difficulties here. All of a sudden, housing in Moscow became mysteriously available. Today, we see Beijing being given lopsided advantages in almost every sphere. Just like the Soviets, the Chinese require our embassy and consulates in China to use the Chinese Diplomatic Service Bureau with their intelligence service assistance, of course, to hire local Chinese solely through them. The lack of reciprocity extends to numbers of students studying in both countries, the numbers of scientists to do research in our national laboratories, the numbers of national centers involved in public diplomacy, numbers of intelligence collectors, and other categories. Who exactly are China's media representatives? None are true professional journalists. The number who even pretend to be reporters is a tiny percentage. Some are party propagandists. Most are intelligence operatives of the Ministry of State Security, the MSS. Most of those officers under media cover are agents of influence and political counterintelligence officers who work in cooperation with the massive Chinese propaganda presence here. Just part of that presence are the aforementioned 81 Confucius Institutes in American universities that both conduct propaganda and stifle criticism of Chinese policies. In contrast, we have only 5 American centers in China that are not independently operated but come under the control of Chinese university officials. Chinese political counterintelligence officers penetrate and harass American organizations that represent groups that pose a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. Beijing calls these groups the 5 poisons. They include the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, the Tibetans, the Taiwanese, the Falun Gong, and pro-democracy groups. These agents identify critics of the Beijing regime, attempt to manipulate their perceptions, and discredit their views. Here, Beijing uses the visa weapon. If you write for a publication of any of the 5 poisons, you're likely to be denied a visa to enter China. If your business advertises in one of their publications, you'll be blacklisted and denied business opportunities in China. Unfortunately, our foreign policy systematically ignores such influence operations and their ability to distort our perceptions of reality. Chinese propaganda is designed to create a false conventional wisdom influencing not only our media but our academic community, from which comes our future intelligence analysts, military officers, and policymakers. Here, the Chinese play the visa game. If an American writes about China's military, intelligence, or their Laogai slave labor system, or other sensitive subjects, they are routinely denied visas. Once denied a visa, a scholar can no longer do field work and bolster his credentials by traveling to China. So they censor themselves. And the fruit of this self-censorship is ever greater lack of knowledge or concern about subjects central to U.S. national security policy making. We saw the identical phenomenon in the Cold War. Beijing corrupts us in other ways. It contributes to the campaigns of American politicians. It uses commercial leverage to influence our businesses and even to blackmail our congressional representatives who vote for legislation like this with the threat of the withdrawal of business in their districts. They hire former cabinet members and military officers to stifle any criticism. I can only scratch the surface of this major national security challenge. I only entreat this committee and the Congress at large to take this challenge seriously and enforce greater reciprocity in the use of visas so that Chinese influence operations can be minimized and U.S. national security can be protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Linkowski. And as you know, your testimony, all your written testimony will be part of the record of the hearing. Our next witness is Dr. Nick Zahn. Mr. Zahn serves as the Asia Communications Fellow and Director of the Washington Roundtable for the Asia Pacific Press at the Heritage Foundation. He manages the largest organization of Asia and Pacific news media in the United States from his office in Heritage Asian Studies Center. Mr. Zahn's responsibility is to advance American leadership, national security by promoting the organization's policy agenda through relationships with international media. Mr. Zahn received his bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. The Washington Roundtable for the Asia Pacific Press at the Heritage Foundation is quite unique among this town's think tanks. It's my duty to get to know the Asia media markets and press corps for purposes of promoting Heritage's work and ideas. This responsibility has given me a firsthand understanding of how these reporters, including China's reporters, operate. In preparing my testimony, I've drawn from this daily interaction as well as some of Heritage's broader work on public diplomacy. And as I look at any comparison between the way the U.S. and China handle one another's government-sponsored press, the single most striking inequity that jumps out at me are the numbers of visas issued. The current imbalance is simply unacceptable. In 2011, the U.S. Department of State approved 868 visas for Chinese state journalists. The Chinese continued the abysmal precedent of allowing Voice of America only 2 visas to work in the People's Republic of China. And as mentioned previously, that's 868 to 2. China's government has consistently rejected visa applications for Radio Free Asia staff since President Bill Clinton's 1998 trip, when 3 personnel were denied travel into the PRC. Compounding the disparity, journalists in China are heavily censored. Both at home and abroad, decisions made by China's Communist Party about desired coverage or censorship of particularly sensitive subjects are issued via the Central Propaganda Department or the State Council Information Offices. Censorship, of course, is a key concern for the party. The party's primary mission for press is to help maintain social and political control, especially during sensitive events such as the 1989 Tiananmen protests or, more recently, the 2008 Beijing Olympics, when public opinion guidance was reviewed by Chinese President and Party General Secretary Hu Jintao. So last year, in February 2011, when activists in China inspired by the Arab Spring called for pro-democracy protests, authorities moved security forces quickly to quash protesters and the corresponding press coverage to go along with it in about a dozen major cities in China. For instance, as a Jasmine Revolution protest got underway on Sunday, February 27, 2011, our 2 VOA correspondents in Beijing, Stephanie Ho and Ming Zhang, went to downtown Beijing to an event site to investigate. Both were detained, manhandled, seriously threatened, and humiliated by uniformed and plainclothes Chinese police. Ho was pushed and shoved into a small store and hustled away in a police van. And although this was his first time being detained in Beijing, Zhang had been detained 8 times outside of Beijing since arriving at the bureau in China in 2007. So this must change. The U.S. needs to be taken seriously as an advocate for liberty, and therefore must actively support the development of an open and objective press corps that works to hold governments accountable. It has long been hoped that the example of our openness would be reciprocated in China, but that has not come to pass. There should be reciprocity between the numbers of China's state-sponsored media allowed U.S. visas and China's visas granted to U.S. government-employed counterparts. If it requires revoking or limiting visas of state journalists to encourage progress on China's end, that's something the U.S. should do. After all, the United States and the PRC are in a contest of ideas. We believe in the idea that governments exist to protect the rights of the people. Opposing that idea is the notion of a government striving to protect itself from the people. The disparity between the courses our 2 countries are taking must be addressed, and the United States must adjust and use all means of diplomacy at its disposal to counter the current trend in the imbalance of state-funded press between the U.S. and China. Elsewise, over time, the prestige of the United States will be made to suffer, and our influence as a force for good will be diminished. And of course, we must not let that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Zahn. While I welcome Mr. Daley here today, I'm going to yield to the gentlelady from California at her request to make the formal introduction.
First, I'm surprised by that because I didn't know I was making the formal introduction, but I did wish to recognize someone who's in our audience here today, and that is Isaac, who is Mr. Daley's son, who is 12 years old and getting a little government lesson here, I hope, in the House Judiciary Committee. So we welcome you, Isaac, and I know that your dad is going to make you very proud today. I'd also like to introduce Mr. Daley. I'll be very quick. He has been the director of the Maryland-China initiative at the University of Maryland since 2007. Prior to that, he was for 6 years the American director of Johns Hopkins University, Nanjing University Center for Chinese and American Studies. He began work on U.S.-China relations as a diplomat for the USIA. After leaving the Foreign Service, he taught Chinese at Cornell University, and for the next 9 years, he worked on television projects in China. He has numerous awards and has been recognized and taught at various institutions. And in the interest of time, I'll simply say welcome, Mr. Daly and Isaac, and we look forward to your testimony.
Before we go to your testimony, Mr. Daly, I'm going to yield myself 30 seconds to introduce a special guest of mine today, who is also a 12-year-old. His grandmother and grandfather are with me. His grandmother has worked for me for 42 years and is retiring this year, and has her grandson, Jake. I know she looks like she must have started when I was 6 years old, or she was 6 years old, but they are both original Washingtonians, but have been in California for 50-some years, and the grandfather, Tom Schill, is a dear friend, 31 years in the FBI, and Jake is here as Mr. Daly's 12-year-old learning about government here in Washington, D.C. So we welcome you, and with that, Mr. Daly, welcome.
Well, thank you, Chairman Gallagly, and thank you, Ranking Member Lofgren, for convening this hearing on media reciprocity with the People's Republic of China. I am sympathetic with what I take to be the impetus for this legislation. There is, in fact, much that is galling, as all of you have already recounted, in China's conduct of its public diplomacy and in the limitations it places on our journalists working in China. China's unblinking disregard for reciprocity should be of concern to the Congress and should be the subject of representations by members of the legislative and executive branches who conduct our relations with China. Still, the retaliatory approach that H.R. 2899 takes to these issues, I believe, is counterproductive. Its enactment would exacerbate problems it seeks to correct and would cast doubt on America's commitment to the free flow of ideas. The proposal we are considering today is that the U.S. expel all or all but 2 Chinese journalists within 30 days of the bill's enactment. America expels China's journalists will be the headline in China and around the world if this bill becomes law. This retaliatory approach would cast the United States not as the defender of reciprocity and press freedom, but as fearful, short-sighted, and cynical about values it has long exemplified. The most striking difficulty with the retaliatory approach is that it considers only the activities of Chinese and American journalists employed by their respective states, ignoring the work of the 200 or so Americans employed by commercial media in China. Because the label government journalist can be rightly applied to all Chinese journalists in America, their numbers should be compared to those of all American journalists working in the PRC, and not just to the number dispatched by the Broadcasting Board of Governors. But even comparing the total number of government and commercial journalists in each country misses the point. Our goal need not be numerical parity. What we seek is an international regime in which all countries may send as many journalists as they desire and can afford to other nations, and in which those journalists may report freely. Beijing accredits only 2 BBG journalists, but even if an unlimited number were allowed to work in the PRC, VOA would only wish to send 6 to 10 reporters to China. So it doesn't solve the reciprocity issue. Not only does the proposed legislation ignore the work of American commercial journalists, it ignores the complexity of modern information networks that shape the public perceptions that we're concerned with here today. Americans learn about China from professional journalists stationed there, but also from non-accredited stringers, writers, and travelers, from corporate reports and academic research, from analyses by government agencies, NGOs, think tanks, and multilateral organizations, and from a growing body of material from China itself and from third countries. American and foreign bloggers and websites that cover China round out what is now a dynamic array of information sources whose output already exceeds the assimilating capacity of any one reader or any one government. And while the Communist Party does strive, as you've heard today, to limit the Chinese people's access to information, the Chinese people, in fact, have a wide range of news sources, accurate and inaccurate, censored and uncensored. Tech-savvy Chinese, especially those who can read English, can gain access, although with some difficulty, to the same array of information that we enjoy. So when we consider the full range of international information sources, and very importantly, when we take account of the fact that America, despite being grossly overspent by the Chinese government, America in fact has vastly more influence on Chinese perceptions and culture than the Chinese Communist Party has on American views and tastes, it is not clear to me which problem H.R. 2899 seeks to solve, nor is it clear how expelling China's journalists would advance the cause of press freedom. Expelling China's journalists would provoke a protracted and ugly series of reciprocal expulsions. In the unlikely event that Beijing declined to expel our journalists, its restraint would allow it to seize the moral high ground while portraying the United States as fearful of scrutiny by Chinese media. And we should bear in mind that Chinese journalists are the primary source of information on the United States for most Chinese readers and viewers. Many of their reports, in fact, are comprehensive and fair. This is, in fact, because many of the reports are simply translations from American media, which are republished in Chinese. It is in our interest that the Chinese receive the information that these reporters provide, even though some of it is biased and inaccurate. Many Chinese writers and editors here in America, impressed by their experience in the United States, push for greater scope and objectivity in Chinese reporting. As advocates for greater press freedom in China, they are more effective than American activists and more effective than they could be if they were not allowed to work here. Expelling them would cut off one of our best channels for promoting press freedom in China. But what is most worrisome in the retaliatory approach is its suggestion that America conduct its public diplomacy on China's terms, competing to see which nation is more willing to restrict media, rather than on the American model of promoting an unfettered exchange of ideas. If we trade the American paradigm for the Chinese approach, we abandon the openness that is the key source of our global influence. If we retain our confidence in the American model, then we can continue to inspire the Chinese people to push for greater freedom. That is what our media and our public diplomacy have done successfully, although not to our complete satisfaction, for the past 30 years.
Mr. Daley, Mr. Daley, the time is, oh, okay, fine. I appreciate you summarizing. With that, I'd like to open the questioning. We are going to be voting in about less than 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to get at least one question in of each member, and so we won't have to call you all back since there's a series of votes. Mr. Lenkowski, in your testimony, you cite historical examples of how absence of reciprocity between the U.S. and Russia was a national security concern. Do you think that the lack of reciprocity between U.S. and China poses a similar national security concern? And if so, could you give us, in a very summarized way, how you would address that issue?
Thank you, sir. I think this is all about national security. That's what this is all about. This is about the problems of perceptions management and the corruption of American accurate perceptions of what is going on in China. There are very few sinologists in the United States compared to the number of Sovietologists during the Cold War. The few that are able to talk about sensitive subjects are extremely limited in number, and one of the problems is that they are even corrupted in other ways in this entire process. For example, there is a major think tank in this town that had a prominent China military analyst, a big donor to that think tank, who had big China business interests, didn't like the accurate and clinical analysis that was coming out of that China military analyst, and arranged to have him fired because he didn't want Americans to become alarmed by China's military buildup, and that might rock the boat in U.S.-China relations and harm his business interests. So the guy was fired, was given hush money, and went on to another think tank where two trustees who were major donors of that think tank threatened to resign and withhold their financial support if that analyst was kept on there. This type of corruption is just unbelievable, and it is going on, and the problem is that the general principle of lack of reciprocity on all of these different matters has a huge effect on self-censorship, as I mentioned, by academics and journalists. And so there's a fundamental perceptions management problem here, which seriously affects our ability as a nation to focus to hear the truth about what China is doing not only in its human rights practices internally, but its aggressive activities abroad, its military buildup, its massive intelligence presence in this country. There are probably tens of thousands of Chinese intelligence operatives in this country because of the style of intelligence collection. And then a large part of this, I don't disagree with Dr. Daly when he talks about the desire of enhancing public diplomacy and representing the free flow of information. My problem here is that most of these people are not real journalists. They are political counterintelligence officers. They are engaged in influence operations here in this country. And what we're talking about here, to a large extent, is reciprocity when it comes not just to journalists, but to intelligence officers. If I have no problem, if some of the number of Chinese media representatives in this country who are actually writing and editing stories, and who are, is minuscule. There are very, very few stories and broadcasts coming out of these people. What are the rest of them doing here? They're engaging in activities that exceed the proper bounds of their media representation or of diplomatic representation. And this is an intelligence problem. It's a perceptions management problem. It is a fundamental subversion of what we're trying to do in this country. During the Cold War, we had some massive expulsions of Soviet intelligence officers. I see no problem with an analogous expulsion of Chinese intelligence officers, who are not only engaging in perceptions management and the subversion of our accurate perceptions of reality, they are also engaging in the massive theft of our intellectual property, which is completely arranged for their huge military buildup of asymmetrical capabilities that are becoming a meaningful potential threat to the United States.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lenkowsky, and I certainly concur with the concerns about intellectual property, as among other things. At this point, I yield to the gentlelady, the ranking member, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. In terms of the reciprocity issue, I'm not sure that that's the right approach, but if I'm reading the material correctly, if we had the approval of every application we made, it would be, wouldn't be 20. And so really what we're saying is that we'd have to, you know what that is? And people get very nervous when the room shakes. That is actually trash compacting down in the basement, so don't worry about it. This bill, if it became law, would simply require the revocation of hundreds of visas. And I'm not sure that, Mr. Daly, as you've mentioned, that's the right message that we want to give. I mean, if, as Mr. Lenkowsky has said, there is, theft of intellectual property, we ought to arrest them and prosecute them. I am not a supporter of what the Chinese government does. They're an oppressive communist regime, that they are not our friends. That's not the issue. The question is how best to deal with this dangerous rival. And I guess the question I have for you, Mr. Daly, is if this bill is not the answer, what are your suggestions about positive steps we could take to address legitimate concerns about reciprocity, but also what steps could we take to increase the flow of free information about freedom into China?
Well, thank you. First, I think that as anybody who has been to China, has spent some time there, and who knows the media environment will realize, while it remains censored and while it is restricted, it is nevertheless more free all the time, fairly dynamic, and there are a number of American media outlets that have a regular presence in China. Sports Illustrated is in Chinese. The Harvard Business Review is in Chinese. It's freely accessible. More popular magazines like National Geographic, things like Cosmopolitan are available. There are groups in China that translate every single article in every edition of the British Economist into Chinese and make it available. So there is, in fact, a lot of information out there already. Nevertheless, I do think that these are serious issues and that we do need to take some of the steps that have been recommended. Reciprocity should be a prominent issue in our China agenda. The President, members of the Cabinet, members of the Congress who deal with China should regularly raise the issues that have been raised here today, numbers of journalists, the access that they enjoy in public and private meetings with the Chinese. We should call them out on this regularly, as we do on intellectual property violations and human rights violations. Elevating reciprocity as an issue would also have an advantage of reminding Americans that the China Daily Supplements and the Washington Post and the New York Times and that the CCTV channels are in fact Chinese Communist Party organs. Secondly, if we are concerned, as has been mentioned here today, with prevailing in a public diplomacy competition with China, then we have to train a large number of experts in a range of professions who are fluent in Chinese and knowledgeable about Chinese history and Chinese culture. So I think that Congress does have an opportunity to provide enhanced support for K-12 Chinese language curricula, for 100,000 strong, and for university programs that train the personnel we need. We can also provide enhanced support for VOA's Chinese language broadcasts. Currently, VOA has limited broadcast hours, and there's a chance to enhance that and to also improve the style of VOA.
Can I ask you a question in terms of these publications that have been translated into Chinese? One of the concerns that we have about what China does is to try and keep their citizens from accessing information on the internet by blocking and the like. To your knowledge, is this information, has it been blocked by the Chinese government? And do you think that we've helped fund Tor and other mechanisms for people to avoid the censorship through good technology? Do you think that would be a positive step forward?
China does block VOA broadcasts. It blocks Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, American commercial media that could have an immediate and profound impact. It blocks these websites because it's American-style press freedom would, in fact, pose an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party. That's true. But the Chinese are also adept at getting around the Great Firewall. Voice of America programs are posted on the VOA, and they get comments from China, tens of thousands.
My time is up. I would just thank the chairman for this hearing and suggest that at some point we might want to actually have a briefing on Tor, because it is something we've helped fund, but it's a way to get around censorship, and it's very exciting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. I would ask a special request of my good friend from Iowa, Mr. King. Would you expedite your questions, because we have 3 votes, and I don't want to come back.
Okay. How much time is left on the clock, Mr. Chairman?
Would you like 3 minutes?
I got to ask if, just a point of information, how much time is left on the vote clock on the floor?
15-minute vote.
Did they just called it now?
Yeah, it just about 2 minutes
Yeah, well,
ago.
I wouldn't absorb any more than 5 minutes, and I think I can get that done. Thank you. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me and for this hearing. It's an interesting testimony that's come before this panel. It causes me to think a little bit about the broader implications, and I'm one who's advocated for a level of reciprocity in a number of areas. This reciprocity advocated for the press personnel. This is a great big subject, and when you think in terms of 1 million visitors from China each year, which Dr. Lenskowski has testified to, and you think about how many agents can be needles in that haystack, and I think that was a really interesting testimony. Then I look back on some of the other things that we have. Religious workers visa. I actually have a bill that requires reciprocity for religious workers. And it recognizes not necessarily that China is a big problem there, since a 5,000 cap on religious workers, but religious workers can come from Saudi Arabia, but it's very, very difficult, if even possible, to bring a Bible into Saudi Arabia. I think there should be a religious workers reciprocity policy as well. The subject was brought up about the intellectual property theft and the in the broad effort on the part of the Chinese, piracy of intellectual property. And that is patents, trademarks, and copyrights, alluded to earlier in this testimony or in the response. And the massive effort to steal American intellectual property and incorporate it into the national defense scheme of the Chinese. Then I think also of a bill that passed out of this committee. The chairman of the committee was, the sponsor of the bill was Mr. Chavis of Utah, and it eliminated the per-country cap in certain visa categories, which was the diversity cap, so that we get a representation from multiple countries across the world. I opposed the bill. I was one of maybe the only Republican to oppose the bill, because it looked to me like it could all be Chinese coming in under those visa categories that were changed. So I'm suggesting this as I listen to this testimony that has brought some of this together for me. I support this bill that Mr. Rohrabacher has brought. I support the international viewpoint that he brings to the United States Congress. And I also would ask if there would be consideration, perhaps to roll all these reciprocity things together so that America can have a reasonable opportunity of competing in the world. The bill that deals with intellectual property that I've introduced, what it does is, and I wrote this bill from Beijing after they had toasted our delegation in multiple cities with the same talking points each time, which was, well, we're going to find some people that are stealing intellectual property, and eventually we will bring felony charges against them and lock them up. And I asked, who's locked up and who's been fined, and are they state-owned businesses? So if they pay a fine, it comes out of one pocket into another. That is what happens in China. So I wrote a bill that directed the U.S. Trade Representative to conduct a study to determine the value of the loss of U.S. intellectual property due to Chinese piracy, and directed then to apply a duty on all Chinese imports in an amount equal to recover that loss of value of intellectual property and an administrative fee in order to distribute those funds back to the proper holders of that intellectual property. That's one of those things where then you say, go ahead and steal the intellectual property, but we're going to charge you back for it. So keep stealing, and we'll keep the money and send it to the people that own the copyrights, the patents, and the trademarks. I support the issue with the press. I think the United States should be a lot smarter. We're an open society that allows access to every aspect of our society. Al-Qaeda has taken advantage of that, as have the Chinese, have our enemies continually. It's amazing to me that our founding fathers could have such wisdom and foresight, and we could have such current day blindsight on this issue. So I raise again the issue of the per-country cap. I believe to eliminate that per-country cap in the Chavis bill was a mistake. It opens the door to the Chinese, and I'd ask consideration to put all of these reciprocity things together so that America can compete on a level playing field. Then I just turn without a question to, since I'm advised not to ask Representative Rohrabacher a question, but to Dr. Lenskowski, to just import to this committee, if you could, the things that you didn't have an opportunity to say, and then at that point I would yield back to the chairman so we can go vote. Thank you.
I very much appreciate Congressman King, your remarks, and indeed this really is an issue which is much larger than just the media issue. And I'm sympathetic to the fact that perhaps this bill may indeed risk making us look a little bit like we're afraid of free flow of information and so on and so forth. But the problem here is that our foreign policy authorities have been incredibly imprudent in how they're managing our overall relations with China. This is the central problem. It's just the way it was with the Soviet Union. I mean, it was incredible that the lack of reciprocity in things that we did with Moscow. I mean, we let them cheat on all their arms control agreements. They had a strategy to cheat on all their arms control agreements, and we lived by ours. There was no reciprocity there.
Dr. Lenkowski, I apologize for interrupting you, but the clock is going. No. If you would be kind enough to put your full answer and make that available to the committee, I would be grateful, and we'll make it a part of the record of the hearing. And with that, I will thank our witnesses all for being here. Without objection, I ask all members will have 5 legislative days to submit to the chair additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded, and ask the witnesses to respond in a timely fashion so we can make them a part of the record of the hearing. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit any additional materials for infusion in the record. Did you?
And I would just say, I'm glad that we won the Cold War.
Yeah, that is a good thing. And with that, I thank you all for being here, and the subcommittee stands adjourned.